Welcome to another edition of News Bites Scotland, and it is a very special and exciting edition. We are very proud to welcome Professor Sir John Curtice, the sophologist and the pollster extraordinaire, and a man who I suspect is probably working about 24 hours a day at the moment and being asked questions by people, and is up there with Nostradamus, I think, for people relying on his outcomes. So welcome and thank you ever so much for joining us, Sir John.
Sure.
Michael, I think you've got some questions for John to start with.
I think Peter's glad that you're on this podcast, John, because he doesn't need to put up with me on his own. So that's good. Obviously, thanks for taking time out because you're such a busy guy at the moment as well. So just as we are, a few weeks away from the election as well, what seats can we look out for? It's going to be kind of like a bit. What seats can we look out for in terms of new MPs coming in?
Well, the crucial question that seems to be uncertain is whether or not the SNP can get to 65 seats or not. Most of the polling conventionally interpreted has suggested not, and that it tends to say the SNP around 60 seats, and that essentially is based on the assumption, given that support for the SNP is down by about 13 points, according to the polls, as compared with 2021. But equally, support for the Conservatives, who came second in 2021, are down by a similar amount. And Labour are also down to some degree. But if those play out evenly across Scotland as a whole, the SNP are still going to pick up the vast bulk of the parliamentary constituencies because they still have something like a 17-point lead. That said, we've had a couple of exercises that have pointed to the SNP getting 67 seats. And these exercises, together with another one that does not, I think shows very, very clearly where the SNP's prospects lie. And it is probably not where most people are thinking of. I suspect most people think of that the crucial battle is in the Central Belt and it's between the SNP and Labour, and that it's on the basis of that the outcome will be determined. Well, what all three of these polls have done, they're so-called multi-regression and post-stratification polls. So they are bigger than usual. They have been statistically modeled to work out what are the kinds of people who are more or less inclined to vote for the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, Labour, Conservative, etc. On the basis of that information, then information from the things like the census about what does each constituency contain in terms of different kinds of people, they come up with an estimate of what the result would be across every constituency. And what this does, it drops the assumption, therefore, that rises and falls in party support are the same everywhere. And that's potentially crucial. Now, what we get from these exercises, we get two quite important messages. The first is that it looks as though the Conservative vote is falling particularly heavily in the places in the northeast, in the borders, which they are currently defending, or indeed in one or two instances that you might think, well, maybe they could pip the SNP for the post. As a result, these exercises are tending to say that the Conservatives are going to end up with relatively few seats, 0, 1 in a couple of instances. So the first crucial set of seats that stand between the SNP and a majority of these, because this therefore means, it depends on the projection, that maybe there are 3 or so seats that the SNP might be able to pick up in the constituencies that they would not get if the geographical movement was uniform. And so that gets us from takes us above the 60 mark to closer to potentially to 65. The second thing, however, you learn is that the Liberal Democrat vote seems to be improving quite notably in constituencies that they're defending, and also in constituencies where they're starting off in second place, and one or two others where they look to be challengers, such as Inverness, Skye, Badenoch, and Loch Harbour. And if the SNP start losing seats, at least to the Liberal Democrats, the pathway to 65 seats begins to disappear. But of course, these Liberal Democrat seats, they're very idiosyncratic. We're talking about the two constituencies in the Northern Isles. We're talking about Fife North East, which is essentially St Andrews University. We're talking about bits of Edinburgh. Very, very, very different kinds of constituencies, but that's the character of Liberal Democrat support. And together with a little bit of well, who's going to win Edinburgh Central, which frankly, I think every pollster's come up with a different answer to that question. That's where the SNP's prospects seem to lie. And the crucial thing to realise, and I perhaps should have said earlier, is that so far as the SNP is concerned, it's basically only the constituency half of the contest that matters. Their prospects of getting an overall majority, given that their support is way down on 2021, just simply rest on the fact that under first past the post, what matters is not your absolute level of support, it's your relative level of support. And the SNP, with a 17-point lead and a geographically evenly spread vote, are basically bound to pick up the vast bulk of the constituencies. It's just that there seem to be potentially enough Conservative and Liberal Democrat fiefdoms that could stop the SNP. But if the SNP can capture the Conservative fiefdoms, that together with a good result across Scotland as a whole, benefiting in particular from the fact that the Greens are only fighting in 6 constituencies, between them, those two things might just take the SNP over 65. But equally, if the Democrats, even if that happens, but if the Democrats start picking up 1 or 2 seats, it could go back below. So I think the truth is it's actually some quite idiosyncratic constituencies, certainly not constituencies that are typical of Scotland in general, that are probably central to whether, the SNP gets 65 seats or not, and therefore John Swinney will feel he can argue whether he's got a mandate. And it's not the SNP Labour battles. Actually, by the way, certainly a couple of these exercises suggest that in probably roughly half the seats that the SNP are likely to win, it's Reform who are running second, and in the other half, it's Labour that are running second. But so unless Reform do particularly well, and one of the polls does suggest, because it has the support for the SNP down about 32% of the constituencies, it suggests Reform could actually be picking up 1 or 2 of those seats that the SNP need to pick up off the Tories. But again, we're still looking at the same idiosyncratic mixture of constituencies. So look to the far north, including the Highlands and Islands, which are always idiosyncratic. Local personalities, local politics matter to a great degree, and look to the far south, the border with England. That could well be the key places where the question that above all seems to be exercising everybody at the moment is likely to be determined.
That's very interesting, John. We obviously you and I met in Thurso when we were when you came up to speak to the Thurso branch up there.
And, well, Caithness, most of the pollsters have down as the Lib Dems picking up.
They absolutely do, yeah. In fact, I've been volunteering on Marie Todd's campaign, and we can't get a poll that says we're going to win it at all. So it's one of those things where if you're being pessimistic and you're going to make a distinction between signal and noise, it's perhaps signal rather than noise. But we're still optimistic. There's been a good ground campaign, and we've got an incumbent minister, and the voting public of Cumberland and Ross seem to be quite discerning. They seem to they've voted for the SNP for Holyrood since 2011, but they've also voted Liberal Democrat since 2017. So there seems to be a deliberate choice that happens.
Exactly. Yeah.
He says,
And,
clutching at straws.
as I've already said, you don't need me to tell you that politics up there is very local.
Absolutely, yeah. Marie is the only one who lives in the constituency, and that carries a weight which it probably wouldn't in the Central Belt, I think.
Sure.
Or Hope is perhaps, yeah. So, I mean, you've said kind of the fringes. Are there any, for you personally, when you're doing the polling, do you have bellwether seats that you tend to check in?
No, short answer, Peter.
I mean, obviously with the MRPs, that's not quite the same.
The point, once you've got the multi-regression and post-stratification, you kind of learn about the geography. To be honest, no. I mean, basically the SNP need to hang on to virtually everything that they have that they won last time. You can play games. I mean, I have done this to one or two journeys, so I'm now trying to remember the exact answer. But I think, for example, Cunningham South, if I remember correctly, is the constituency where the outcome last time is the closest to what it was across Scotland as a whole. But in that sense, it's potentially a bellwether. But to be honest, it's not something on which I am particularly focusing.
I was going to pick you up on John, because for weeks, even before that election, it was they were saying that Labour will come third or maybe fourth in the matter. Do you think it's anything to do with the leader, kind of Anna Sarwar, coming out and making statements about Keir Starmer? Obviously, Keir Starmer came up to Scotland last weekend. They weren't to be seen together. But also as well, he made a remark about people like having a stroke. So do you think that's why the vote's going down, or do you think people are just sick and tired of?
Yeah, I mean, it's not obvious that Labour's vote's particularly falling in recent weeks. I mean, the point that Labour's vote fell by the autumn of last year, largely in parallel with the fall in Labour support across the UK as a whole. It's perhaps a reminder of the myth that Scottish Labour created for itself before the 2024 election. The myth that it created for itself was that it was winning over large numbers of votes from the SNP because of the poor record of the SNP government. Together with the fact that the party across the UK had been reformulated and by Keir Starmer. The brutal truth is that the rise of the Labour Party in Scotland occurred primarily for exactly the same reasons that support for Labour rose across the UK as a whole, and that is one, Partygate, and two, the Liz Truss fiscal event. Labour started to move ahead of the Tories in the polls in Scotland in the wake of Partygate, and they got to about close to the 35% that they got in the general election by the time of the Liz Truss fiscal event. They certainly got to 30% by then. It was only latterly, with the difficulties of the SNP during the SNP leadership contest and then the tenure of Humza Yousaf as leader, that Labour began to pick up a bit more support. But given, therefore, the foundations of the rise of the Labour Party in Scotland was essentially based on developments at Westminster, lo and behold, the fall of the Scottish Labour Party in Scotland is also primarily the product of developments at Westminster. I understand why Anna Sarwar is trying to separate himself from the UK Labour government. It's just proving very difficult. I mean, I do well remember, if you were talking to Scottish Labour politicians in the immediate wake of the 2024 election, you could see them eyeing up the curtains and the carpets of Bute House. They had a confident expectation. And you did kind of feel slightly curmudgeonly when you kind of said, well, of course, you do realise you'll have to fight the election in the midterm of a Westminster government. And, this does tend to be quite difficult. Not that any of us could necessarily anticipate that it's going to be as difficult as it was, that because no previous newly elected government has lost so much support so early in term of its office as the current Labour government has done. But Anna Sarwar's, you can see. The fundamental problem is you ask people in Scotland how good a job the Labour government is doing, and even those people who voted Labour in 2024 give it a on balance, a negative rating. Ask people whether or not they trust the Labour Party on to trust to make right decisions on the two big issues of the economy and on health. Again, 2024 Labour voters on balance give Labour a negative rating. The level of dissatisfaction and discontent and disappointment with the Labour government, and it's not unique to Scotland, is very, very pervasive. Now, Anna Sarwar has been trying to get around this by saying, well, hang on, it is not an election about the UK Labour government. It's an election about the record of the Scottish government, and I feel that the Scottish government have not done a good job. And if you focus on that, then it's clear you will want to vote for a change, and we are the party best place to deliver change. Now, to be honest, I am quite surprised that the Scottish Labour Party thinks that effectively repeating the same strapline as the Labour Party used in 2024 was in any way going to be politically effective. I mean, you're just reminding people of the campaign that Labour fought in 2024, a campaign that failed to define what the Labour government would be about. And that's been one of the crucial reasons why it's lacked a sense of political direction and leadership ever since. But anyway, the problem is that actually some nice polling, I think it was Norstat for the Sunday Times that did it, I think that's right, and asking people, so on whose record are you voting? And what you discover is that 2024 SNP voters, at least, are more likely to say they are voting on the record of the Scottish government than are other voters, including Labour and Conservative voters. So it's not the case that, the problem is that SNP voters are focusing their eyes on Westminster. They're not, because frankly, SNP voters are relatively nationalist. They're more particularly concerned about Scotland. They would like to be rid of Westminster. They're actually more inclined to focus on Holyrood anyway. The problem that Anna Sarwar has, apart from the fact that those who voted for Labour in 2024 think the party has done a lousy job, is that on balance, at least the much diminished band of SNP, much diminished band of folk who voted for the SNP in 2024, they think on balance that the SNP is doing a good job, and they are inclined to trust the SNP on the so-called day-to-day issues of the economy and of the health service. So therefore, this is not, as Labour think, an election in which whoever can determine the agenda, i.e. whether the agenda is about the UK government or about the Scottish government, will decide the fate of the election. SNP voters are, for the most part, looking at Holyrood and they're giving it the thumbs up. And that's Labour's fundamental problem.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think there is potentially actually an optimism bias within SNP members themselves and voters,
of course,
which you do pick up on the door. It's quite interesting. And one of the things, it kind of leads me on to the next question, but one of the things that we are picking up on the door is you say to people, that, like you say, previous Labour voters who will say, "Oh no, we're coming. We're done with that." And I say, "Well, they did promise you change, and they never told you it would be good or bad, and they've delivered." And then sort of people roar with laughter. And so even the people that voted for Labour are absolutely scunnered with that. It's certainly up here.
Yeah, but then Peter, what you then also need to realise, however, and this is perhaps the more less comfortable bit for folk who support the SNP, is that actually the party that's taking most votes off Labour is Reform. Reform are a bigger problem for Labour in Scotland than they are south of the border because of Labour's relative success in picking up votes directly from the Tories in 2024. Labour was much more successful in picking up Tory votes north of the border than they were south of the border, in part because they were picking up some of the folk who had voted tactically for the Conservatives in 2017 and 2019, when the Tories seemed best placed to defeat the SNP locally. And now a lot of them clearly switched to Labour, apart from those constituencies where the Conservatives still had a modicum of strength. And And it does that. And at the end of the day, it's the fact that Reform have taken another quarter of the Conservative vote. They're taking about 1 in 6 of the Labour vote. And they're taking some Liberal Democrats as well, whereas they're taking virtually nobody off the SNP. That is helped to ensure that the Unionist vote is fragmented. And the truth is, right, the SNP is barely any more popular now than it was in 2024. And people say, well, how is it possible for the SNP to be looking at the possibility of winning election after 20 years in office? The answer is, it's nothing magic about the SNP. It's everything to do with the weakness of their opponents, because their opponents' vote has gone down so sharply that therefore 35% of the vote is enough. But I think, there is a very striking parallel here. A key reason why Keir Starmer was able to get an overall majority, a large overall majority at Westminster, was because of Reform took a whole barrel load of votes off the Tories, reduced the Tory share of the vote, and they're enabling Labour to win lots of constituencies. Exactly the same thing is now happening to the SNP's benefit north of the border, except Reform are taking votes off both the Tories and off Labour. So the SNP are getting a double bonus.
I absolutely, funnily enough, I absolutely agree with that. And that brings me into what I was about to ask you, which is that fragmentation of the Unionist vote.
Yes.
Which I'm assuming you are seeing kind of nationwide in your polling.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but equally, it is. I mean, the other thing to realise is that one of the other myths that's out there is that voters don't care about the constitutional question. It's yesterday's story. They want to focus on what the government's going to do about the bread and butter issues of the cost of living and the health service, etc., etc. And this particularly tends to come from Unionist commentators.
Yeah.
Tell that to the average Unionist voter. The polling indicates that fewer 1 in 10 of people who say they would vote no are currently minded to vote for the SNP or the Greens on the constituency vote. And the days when the SNP, this is what did happen in 2011, the days when the SNP could pick up a lot of votes from Unionist voters, basically on the grounds of we're the party who will stand up most for Scotland vis-a-vis Westminster, and they got about 40% of the Unionist vote in 2011. Those days are over. The problem for the SNP, however, is that their command of the yes vote is still not at the kind of level that it was in 2021. You can tell that 35% of the vote, according to most polls, 50% still, roughly speaking, in support for independence. Now, again, was where the YouGov MRP poll was interesting. The YouGov MRP poll put the SNP support up much higher, 41%, and in part, at least, that looks as though it's because they were taking the Green vote out in the constituencies where they're not fighting. Though I think it's also true that the SNP share in that poll, and also, by the way, the Tory vote is unusual as well. The SNP vote is unusually high, even on the list vote, and the Tory vote is very low. No, and they may be right, but still, that again, that's why I was saying earlier, one of the crucial ways and potential foundations of getting to 65 is what happens to the Green vote, which was apparently 8% of the vote before the Greens said they weren't going to fight most of the constituencies. Where does that go? It won't all go to the SNP, but even if 6% goes to the SNP and the rest of it is scattered, that 35% can begin to look like 40% fairly rapidly. I don't think on its own that's not enough to take the SNP over the line. It needs to be that and the collapse in the Tory seats and not losing to the Lib Dems.
Yeah. Do you have a feeling on the kind of the possibility away from? I mean, I think the SNP. How likely is it that this kind of Reform, Labour, Tory deal and Lib Dem deal that we're seeing in Fife Council being recreated at Holyrood?
You mean if indeed the SNP and the Greens get fewer than 65 seats, will we see some kind of Unionist-led administration?
Yeah, I do.
I think that speculation got fueled because the More in Common poll, which has the SNP at an unusually low figure,
Yeah,
and
that
also
felt downward.
suggests that the SNP would not profit much from the geographical variation in party support. That had the SNP and the Greens at 64 rather than 65. I think my reaction is that there would be a substantial risk that, let us say, a minority Labour administration that was reliant on all of Conservative, Liberal Democrat and Reform MSPs, to get Sarwar elected, which, I mean, frankly, Labour, as long as Labour puts Sarwar up, they can't control who votes for him. There's a bit of a misunderstanding there. It doesn't need to be any deal with Reform. They can Reform his vote for them. Yeah. Let us say that happens. I think you have to ask yourself, how long would that government manage to survive? Would it be able to get a budget through, etc.? And of course, if then the government loses a vote of confidence, and if they can't then elect another first minister within 30 days, we're all back to the polls again. So I think that, apart from the potential reputational risk to Labour of doing a deal not just with or being seen to be in hot not just with the Tories but to Reform, the stability of that administration must be in doubt. I think, to be honest, what you'll be looking at with that kind of outcome is you're looking at the SNP, around 55, 56 seats. I mean, and that's quite, I still think it's in the bounds of possibility, but that's going to be a much tougher gig than is 60 seats, and certainly a much, much tougher gig than 65 seats. And it would certainly mean if the Greens were not doing as well as we mostly expect, then the SNP couldn't just simply maintain a stable government by doing a deal with them. They would undoubtedly be having to talk to the Democrats for quite a lot, and negotiating that parliament would be quite difficult. Whereas for the most part, most of the polling suggests if the SNP don't get to 65, at least they will be able to play, divide and rule with Liberal Democrats and the Greens, because there will be two parties there who are biddable, at least in principle, on individual items of legislation and on a budget, etc., and where the SNP could hope to get things over the line. I mean, obviously, I think what is true is the SNP will not want to be seen in any way to be involving Reform. The days when the Tories are willing to sustain a minority SNP administration are in the dim and distant past. And I don't think Labour are going to make life for the SNP at all easy as well. So the options are limited, but you can see how you could maintain administration. And of course, the other thing, again, I think it's worth bearing in mind, I mean, leaving aside the question of 65 seats for the SNP, what would be crucial? What would be crucial if indeed SNP plus Green was only 64 seats, is that it would mean that there wasn't the votes at Holyrood to pass the legislation for an independence referendum. And that is, in my view, crucial, because although a pro-independence majority at Holyrood is not a sufficient condition for another referendum, I think it's a necessary condition, because I don't think Westminster itself is going to legislate. The most that's ever going to happen is that Westminster is going to do another Section 30 order. And that really is only going to happen if at some point in a future Westminster Parliament, the SNP have leverage. But you can only exercise the leverage if you've got a pro-independence majority at Holyrood. So that's where, actually, I think probably, if More in Common are right, we're probably talking about a deeply minority SNP administration, although not as minority as 2007. But we're probably still talking about an SNP administration, but it would mean that the independence referendum was well and truly on the back burner.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Michael, I wonder if you've got any questions coming
Yeah,
in.
no, a couple of questions. I might kind of move it on and go back and forth, because I'm kind of like that sometimes. But Russell Finlay, I'm interested to hear about your take on what he's been saying, John, before the kind of like TV debates as well, when it's been doing kind of like one-to-one interviews. Now, if you are a Conservative fan, I think you would be a bit disappointed the way that he's coming out and saying that look, I'm kind of realistic. I won't be the first minister. Do you think that's going to take the vote down any, or do you think he's playing the sympathy card to get more votes?
He's being, frankly, very honest, but my experience of Mr. Findlay is he tends towards the honest side of the spectrum, so far as most politicians are concerned. I mean, there comes a point at which trying to claim that black is white doesn't enhance a politician's credibility. What I do find intriguing about the Tories is the extent to which they are saying vote for us on the list vote. And it's almost as though it gives the impression that they've given up on their prospects of being able to hang on to constituency seats they have got. But as I've said, the implication what I said earlier is that actually if the Conservatives want to stop the SNP having an overall majority, they need to be trying to hang on to those seats, because that could be absolutely crucial. So I found the emphasis on the list vote and saying, at least vote for us on our peach vote, is now going saying, well, look, we kind of know that you think that you might want to vote for the Labour Party if you're a Unionist voter, because Labour Party look as though they've got a better chance in more constituencies of making life difficult for the SNP. But, please come back to us for the list vote. But actually, they, at least in those half dozen constituencies where the Tories should at least be in the game, that's not the message they should be getting. They'll be saying, you need to vote for us because we can stop the SNP causing Scotland so much trouble.
That I kind of follow up kind of question to that, John, is that the TV debates, obviously we've had two already, one on BBC Scotland and one on Channel 4, albeit the Channel 4 one was on for 45 minutes, and then I think we've got one more coming up at the end of the month. Did you see the polls going shifting any time in between these kind of like debates, so that been
we've had so little polling since those. I mean, the polling in Scotland doesn't come with the degree of regularity that you get in Britain wide for one to get any idea about this. But to be honest, I didn't see the Channel 4 one. I was out doing something or other. I saw the BBC Scotland one. I think most independent commentators felt that nobody landed a killer blow. There was a feeling that John Swinney was somewhat defensive, and that probably Ross Greer was the most impressive performer on the night, but that frankly nobody really landed a decisive blow. I'm obviously aware that then there was the comments from Malcolm Offord about Anna Sarwar having spoken to him in the green room after a previous engagement, which may or may not be true. I guess my reaction to that was partly that, my understanding is that basically what is said in the green room stays in the green room. It is it's a space where sometimes politicians will say things to you on the assumption that then you're not going to repeat it. At least you're certainly not going to attribute it. And it's also a place where, particularly after a television performance, and maybe there's an opportunity to socialize afterwards, that you might have a little bit of banter. Because the honest truth is that for the most part, particularly I think this is true in Holyrood, relationships between politicians of different parties tend to be quite good. They're willing to talk to each other. They're reasonably sociable. They're willing to share a joke. And you can imagine how in those circumstances that, you might say, Sarwar might say, Sarwar's very personable, very engaging personality. And you might say, God, Malcolm, of course, you and I are going to have to fight each other like hammer and tongs. But of course, we both know that what we're really trying to do is to stop the SNP. Now, I don't know whether that's what he said or not, but one could imagine that kind of thing being said somewhat lightheartedly, in jest, a recognition of the realpolitik of the situation. I'm not expecting it to be repeated weeks later on air in a live TV program. Now, maybe Mr. Offord's got an explanation, but I certainly kind of take the view that and Mr. Offord is not an experienced politician. is that maybe he wasn't fully recognizing what I would regard as part of the etiquette of the game, in terms of what is said in the relative privacy of a green room before a debate. When, the truth is that even if they don't get on with each other, the 5 leaders or the 6 leaders are forced to be with each other in the same room for a while. And you can either all sit there and say now and look at each other, daggers drawn, or you can actually be sociable with each other and polite to each other, and pass the light of day. Maybe talking about small talk, but even again, you might, can imagine politicians saying, "Oh no, how's it going? Oh God, it's tough, out in so and so. I'm getting the door shut in my face all the time." And then somebody replying, "Yeah, I've had exactly the same experience." Right? I think probably whatever the truth was or wasn't said, it might have been best if it wasn't repeated in public.
Do you think that was to do with kind of like headlines as well? Because obviously that was, I think that debate was on a Wednesday night or something, whatever. Do you feel as though that was to kind of like grab the headlines, but also maybe it was to say that we are a kind of new party and we are new to Scotland, come and support us?
Well, I presume the motivation is that. I think if I say I didn't watch that particular debate, but my understanding of the context is that Sarwar was being particularly critical of Offord. He was, attacking his position, and that as a result, Offord was trying basically to respond and kind of to suggest that Sarwar's attempt to distance himself from reform was not necessarily a true reflection of his true views. But that's politics.
I'm afraid I've just been in and out of that stream. I got booted out, so I missed half of that answer.
I was basically talking about the etiquette of the green room, and expressing the view that my understanding of the etiquette of these situations is that what is said in the green room stays in the green room. I am certainly clear that if in the privacy of that room, a politician were to say something to me that was kind of clearly not something they'd want to be known in public, they might well say, it really is tough.
Highland Wi-Fi.
It really is tough, and the polls are right. I would just accept that was said to me in private. Okay.
I wanted to ask you about obviously nowadays in different interviews as well that you hear the everybody's talking about social media. What role does social media kind of like play in this election, John? Because
well, I don't claim to be an expert on the impact of social media. I've done a little bit of research in the area, though my views are also somewhat coloured by the fact I did do quite a lot of work on particularly the impact of newspapers in the days when people were still reading newspapers, basically 30 years ago. My understanding of the role of social media is that it's quite good at being able to mobilize existing supporters. People will tend to find on social media, and this is partly to do with the echo chamber factor, that people will find on social media messages that reinforce. So that therefore, when campaigns are putting messages out, they're essentially putting out messages that basically might succeed in reinforcing the partisanship of those who are already on side and may help to encourage them to turn out to vote. What social media, for the most part, is not very good at is persuading anybody. The messages are too short. There's very little in terms of the content. So unless it's something, and of course, obviously, this is where, for example, the concern about deep fakes, which is one of the things that the Electoral Commission is monitoring during this election, so that therefore, words are put in the mouth of a politician which would appear to seem to cast doubt on their integrity or whatever, as a result of the use of AI, etc. That is something that maybe could cause a politician trouble, but of course the truth is, and it might get disseminated quite widely before it gets called out. So far, I'm not aware of any particular deep fakes that have caused any particular viral circulation. So I think the answer to you is, helps to keep the troops on side, but doesn't really increase the size of the army.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, you're obviously doing MRP polls now, but I'm assuming across the course of your career, you've seen an enormous change in the kind of methodology and so I mean, yes. do you enjoy the? I mean, is the MRP the flavor of the month? Is it something that you enjoy, or do I suppose a potted history of psephology, really?
Well, I mean, when I started in the game, the way the opinion polls were done is by interviewers knocking on doors and trying to fill a quota of people with certain characteristics that they were meant to try and interview in a defined geographical area. Now, most polling is done online, either with panels that the companies themselves have recruited, or in some cases by so-called panel providers. Yeah, it's a very, very different game. The point about MRP is that it's taking advantage of the economics of internet polling, which is much cheaper, and therefore deploying very large sample sizes, and then basically you're using a statistical technique that's been developed, kind of 10, 20 years ago. And the point is that under first past the post, it's not just how many votes you get, it's their geographical distribution that matters, okay? What we have tended to do in British politics historically is to say, well, as I've been referring to earlier on, let's just assume that if the polls say that the Conservatives are up 5 and Labour are down 5, that means there's a 5% swing from Labour to Conservative everywhere. And we will just assume that happens in every constituency. And although that won't get every constituency right, it will be roughly right because the geography won't fundamentally change. Now, in 2024, the geography fundamentally changed. Support for the Conservatives fell most heavily in places where they're previously strongest. People were willing to vote tactically on the greatest scale since 1997 for either Labour or the Democrats in order to get the Tories out. And it so happened that, YouGov have been doing a certain amount of MRP polling before. It got quite a good reputation because they managed to call 2017 as a hung parliament when most regular polling had not, although actually they slightly underestimated the Tories. But that got people interested. But in 2019, actually, it didn't make a great deal of difference whether you did MRP or not. But in 2024, it did. And it so happened by 2024, most polling organizations had taken on board in their staff 1 or 2 people who could do the MRP analysis. And it was just the right election at which to do it. Now, of course, in truth, because Scotland's got a proportional system, it shouldn't make a great deal of difference. However, as we've been saying, because it looks as though it's what happens in the constituencies that matters, and that's first past the post, therefore, it is potentially telling us something that we need to know, as per our earlier discussion. Of course, it is true that MRP polling is also being deployed in Wales. And you might be saying, well, why bother there? Because that's now a wholly proportional system. Well, the answer is it does depend on whether or not you get about 12% of the vote or not, because you've got to get about 12% of the vote before you're likely to pick up a seat in one of the mega constituencies are now being deployed. And for example, again, because it looks as though the Conservative vote in Wales is falling more heavily in places where they were previously strongest, some of the MRP polling suggests they may end up with very little in the way of representation in the Senate. So again, the MRP does tell you something that you need to know, because even there, the geography makes a difference. There's also, by the way, been some quite useful MRP polling of the local elections in England, which is the first time anybody's done MRP polling of local elections, and that shows you quite a lot of interesting material as well. So I actually wrote, and it's not yet been published, but I actually wrote an evaluation of the success of the MRP polling or otherwise in tapping into and identifying the geographical variation in party support. And although the MRP polls had tended to have a pro-Labour bias in much the same way as all the polling tended to do in 2024, once you discount that, the difference in party support that they identified between different kinds of constituencies was a very, very good guide to what was going to happen. The one thing they couldn't pick up, and it's not surprising because this is a relatively small number of constituencies, was the success of independent candidates in constituencies with large numbers of Muslims. And indeed, they tended to underestimate the extent to which Labour's vote was collapsing in such constituencies. But again, it's a small number of constituencies with rather particular characteristics. But in terms of the big story, I mean, it made election night so much easier because you just thought, yeah, we knew this was going to happen. It's just playing out exactly as happened. People were going, how can it possibly be true that the Tories will only end up with 100 seats? Well, you just need to look at the geography. This is a disaster just waiting to happen. And lo, it just fell out. So it's a great addition to the litany of polling. It's like all polling, it's not infallible. And the three MRP polls we've got there, they all agree about the Tories problem. They disagree as to whether or not the SNP votes falling more heavily in places where they were previously strongest, and then whether or not that makes any difference. And that's one of the things where I think the jury is still out.
That's really fascinating. Thank you for that. Michael, do you want to come in there?
Something that you said at the top of the interview, John, and something that's been in our kind of politics for a few years now. And I don't know if you do any polling on this, but because like Scotland, kind of Wales and Northern Ireland wants kind of independence, do you feel as though that, well, obviously according to the polls, do you feel as though that Westminster is not really working for these kind of like countries?
Well, I mean, for the most part, duck that question because that's a wee bit political. But of course, what is worth saying is that Rhys Earworth looks as though he's going to become the next First Minister of Wales. It doesn't really matter who comes first because Reform won't have the MSs to get a First Minister elected, whereas Labour should be able to take Plaid over the line. And that will mean, again, making the not unreasonable assumption that John Swinney remains as First Minister up here, that there'll be a Nationalist First Minister in Scotland, a Nationalist First Minister in Wales, and of course there's a Nationalist First Minister in Belfast. This, at least we can say, means that devolution is not working out in the way that Westminster hoped. Let's put it that way. And that rather than helping to maintain the integrity of the Union, it has created a pathway for the SNP to have power for the first time in its history. It now looks as though it's going to pave the way for Plaid to have power for the first time in its history. And of course, it's already paved the way for Sinn Féin not to have unalloyed power because of the features of the Good Friday Agreement, but still to be First Minister. Well, this is not was envisaged 30 years ago when all of this was put into place. And of course, what it does open up is the possibility. I mean, there's already been a certain amount of collaboration between the devolved institutions in Scotland and Wales, even with the Labour Party running Wales, vis-a-vis, stances vis-a-vis things that the UK government have been saying and doing. But the opportunity for doing that will be obviously even greater. And that is at least going to be, one of the ways in which will make life for a UK government a wee bit more difficult. If all three devolved administrations say, this is not right, we think it should be changed, it's disadvantaging us, etc., then, to think of, one obvious issue is that, almost inevitably, the UK government, whatever its partisan colour, is going to have to spend more money on defence. Defence doesn't create Barnett consequentials, and so therefore but it does potentially squeeze spending on those things that do have binary consequentials. And you can see how Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland might all be saying, hang on, this isn't fair, something needs to be done about this. We can debate the merits of that argument, but you can see how they, but given that they're all of a similar outlook, might find it easy to come up with a common case that pursues that particular argument.
I mean, a slight extension to that question, I suppose, is with no Prime Minister having finished a full term, a UK Prime Minister having finished a full term since 2005, having been elected with a
no. Cameron survived for his 5 years. He only resigned in 2016.
I thought did he not finish early by
No. He finished early in 2016, having lost the Brexit referendum. But he was in power from 2010 to 2015, right?
I was just in 2010 to, okay. So is the UK ungovernable full stop in the last 10 years?
No, but we have had a history of Prime Minister. Well, Cameron lost the referendum, so he decided he's going to resign. Because he wasn't going to pursue the domestic agenda he clearly wanted to pursue. I mean, thereafter, you've had prime ministers who have struggled to do the job in a variety of ways. Theresa May, because she couldn't get her party to unite behind a vision of Brexit, which was a relatively soft vision. Boris Johnson, because, he again... you kind of knew, but Boris Johnson was a brilliant campaigner, but you kind of always went, but how would he be good? How good would he be in government? And you could almost see, it's like, it was a Greek tragedy. You could see that Boris was going to get there, and you could see it was going to end in tears, which it did, basically. And in the end, basically, because his relatively loose relationship with the truth was his undoing, because he wasn't honest about what he knew about the sexual behaviour of the deputy chief whip. I mean, that's what undid him. Together, by the way, the revenge of the civil service. Lord MacDonald, who's been quite voluble in the recent days vis-a-vis the fate of Ollie Robbins, was the person who brought Boris Johnson down. It was him who declared in public that the Foreign Office had told Boris Johnson, when he was a Foreign Office minister and when Mr. Pincham was also in the Foreign Office, about the difficulties surrounding Mr. Pincham's behaviour. So, be careful about taking on Lord MacDonald, I think. Anyway, and then, of course, Liz Truss, it all blew up. And the trouble with Starmer is that he's not a politician. He's not very good at leadership. His party support's fallen away dramatically, and that's why. And again, he's made one really bad mistake, which was the appointment of Mandelson, and then there are arguments about who said what and to whom and all the rest of it, and he's in trouble. Yeah, and you can see how
he really is.
The Labour Party is wondering about whether or not they should get rid of him. What is needed is somebody who can do the job, right? And there's a fundamental problem about the lack of obvious, evident, high-quality leadership in the traditional British governing parties.
And I think that becomes more true if he then wakes up with separatist governments in all of the devolved powers.
It'll add to his headaches. But at the end of the day, it will be whether or not Labour MPs think that he's just heading them towards disaster or not. I mean, the disadvantage.
If they do decide to topple him, do you think that will precipitate another general election, or will they appoint a term?
No. That's the last thing in Labour MPs' mind. No. I mean, one of the reasons why Starmer's biggest advantage is that there is no obvious successor. And if they try to topple him, there will be a divisive contest. Starmer may well insist on standing. And the problem Labour Party MPs have is, even if they think that Starmer is leading towards disaster, is how to get from where they are at the moment to where they would like to be without having too much collateral damage along the way. And of course, none of the potential successors who are currently in the House of Commons are particularly popular either. Now, we might then interestingly debate about whether some of them are better, might be proved to be better at the job than Keir Starmer. But none of them would start with a particularly favourable public profile. The one person who does have a relatively favourable public profile is Andy Burnham. But then we don't know how good he would be at doing the job because he's not in cabinet. Now, of course, he does have experience as health minister before 2010. But again, there's a bit of a similarity here between Bernie and Swinney, right? I mean, Swinney wasn't very comfortable as SNP leader first time around. 20 years later, older, more comfortable in his skin. He's been rather more accomplished, though I'm still not sure he's really got quite the charismatic qualities that are required. He can hold the ship steady, but it's not really somebody who's going to necessarily set the heather on fire. Burnham was not very comfortable at Westminster. One of the reasons why he got out, and I think the fascinating question is if he goes back to Westminster, would he in fact now be able to deal with the bear pit of the House of Commons? I feel more comfortable about that in the way that as compared with how he felt previously, and that obviously is a bit of an unknown.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Excellent. Right, Michael, any final question?
No, obviously it was fascinating, John, to get behind the numbers and talking and stuff like that. But no, I was really interesting. And
okay, jolly good. Okay, well, nice to talk to you. Best of luck. Hope I haven't upset too many SNP supporters with some of what I've said, but there's no point having me on unless you're willing to accept that I might occasionally say some things that you disagree with, or I say something.
I think the truth will set us free, and there's quite enough people telling us what we want to hear in this world. And so, it doesn't sound like doom and gloom, but it does sound like it's interesting times.
Yeah, well, I admire your spirit.
We get. Well, if you could see a route to us winning Caithness, Sutherland, and Ross, that would be very nice. But that's
for you to work out and to me to commentate on.
I suppose final thing is, where will you be on polling day? What's your polling day?
On polling day, I'll be sitting in a hotel in London, probably trying to catch up with the day job because it's the one day of that week where we're not either broadcasting or rehearsing. So I'm basically based with BBC Network in London. You'll see me beamed up to the Scotland programme on the Friday for some of the time. But basically, all the psephologies being and number crunchings being run out of London because we're doing Scotland, Wales, local elections. And just bear a thought for us. Okay, Scotland have decided to count on Friday, and Wales have decided to count on Friday. But a third of the English councils are counting on Thursday night. So then we will be preoccupied with that. And then we're trying to keep our eyelids open as we find out whether or not the SNP are going to get 65 seats about 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. And to be honest, the broadcasters would be much happier if Scotland and Wales were counting overnight as well.
I just wanted to ask you on the final thought on that, John, because you've opened my next question for me. In terms of this is the first year Scotland just will find out the results on its day. How different would that be? Looking for
no, that's not quite true because 2021 counted on Friday because of the COVID pandemic. And there were very, very few. There was a handful of English councils that counted overnight. I mean, I actually had. We didn't run an overnight program. I actually had about 5 hours kip, which was wonderful. But everything happened on the Friday in 2021, and I think that may be part of the reason why that's now been replicated, even though the circumstances have changed. And in any event. I think my memory is that not everywhere necessarily counted overnight. It was kind of a lot of the constituencies and not all. But the problem, of course, with the Friday count is that it just needs one constituency to need a recount. And they decide that that's the position at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. and it runs into Saturday. And that's what the broadcasters will really hate. Because you not only lose that constituency result, you also lose that result.
Yeah, I will be at the count in Inverness, and we will be getting ballots from Sky, and they're doing the Inverness one, and they're doing Caithness.
And of course, Inverness ended up going into Saturday for 2024.
Yeah, so we'll be, if there's a recount, we'll be there. You know, if the boxes get delayed, or it's the potential for it to get delayed are quite high, I would suggest.
Yeah.
Well, I was a candidate in 24. I had to live through that. It was great fun. That was absolutely brutal going to the third recount.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
That will live long in the memory.
Their fate by then. You're kind of just hoping against hope that maybe somebody will find a bundle that's in the wrong place, but you probably know that you've had it.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly did. Right. Yeah. So, Professor Sir John Curtice from the University of Strathclyde and the National Centre for Social Research, thank you ever so much for joining us on Newsbite Scotland. We are very, very grateful, but we're now going to clamp our jaws shut. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Peter.
And I will see you again soon.
Yep.